So, hello there, and welcome back to another Night of the Movies podcast. I'm Spike Knight, and in these podcasts, I like talking all things movies and TV, and whatever I want, whenever I want. And in today's podcast, as you may have guessed already, I'm continuing on with my Star Wars film reviews as I review Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. But just before I get into my review of that film, I want to quickly say that I have hay fever right now, so if I'm sniffling throughout this podcast, I do apologise, I can't help it. It's because it's that time of the year and hay fever gets me quite badly, so also if I don't make complete sense during this podcast, it's because that's what hay fever is doing to me. But other than that, this should be a great and fun podcast to listen to and or watch. So, let's get into it, shall we? Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. The film that started it all. The Star Wars phenomenon. Did I pronounce that word correctly? Yeah, I think I did. Wow. I don't usually pronounce the word phenomenon correctly, so there we go. Anyway, the film that started the Star Wars phenomenon. Originally titled Star Wars, this film released in 1977 and quickly became one of the biggest films of all time and one of the most influential movies of all time as well. However, I wasn't around when this film came out, and for me, this was the fourth Star Wars movie that I watched. I watched The Phantom Menace first. That was my first experience with Star Wars, and then I watched Attack of the Clones, and then I watched Revenge of the Sith, and then I went on to A New Hope. And I think that's one of the reasons I don't love this movie. And that's kind of the point, well, it's not kind of the point, it's the point of this podcast today. I'm talking about my honest opinion on A New Hope, because there's so much I admire about this film. There is so much I admire about it, and I think it's so wildly entertaining to watch, and I can understand why it's one of the most influential films of all time. I love the context surrounding this movie. I love all the stories from the behind the scenes, how the special effects weren't ready 6 months before the film was meant to come out in cinemas. I love all these things about the movie that I'm going to talk about in more detail later on in this review. But I don't love the film. And I think I don't love it because, to me, it feels more like a self-contained story, whilst for a franchise that's so interconnected, I would have liked there to be more setup for the sequels, because I didn't know this for the longest time. This was the first Star Wars movie made. For the longest time, I thought that the first Star Wars movie made was The Phantom Menace, because that was the first Star Wars movie I watched. And so watching the Star Wars movies in chronological order, like I did, and getting to this movie, I was like, oh my god, why does it look different? Why did Revenge of the Sith have this clean look to it, but A New Hope has this 70s look to it? It looks like a film that was made in the 70s. Why don't the effects look quite as good as they did in the previous three movies? Why are we following two droids that weren't that important in the previous three films? Why does this film feel so, small compared to the previous three films? That's what my thought process was the first time I watched this movie. And over time, my liking of this film has increased a lot. I've never disliked this film at all. But the first time I watched it, I found it quite a jarring watch. I'm like, what is this movie? Why is it so different than the previous three films? And once I realised, I was like, oh, that's why it was different. That's why this film is the way it is. And that's why it doesn't look the same as the prequels. And growing up, I always preferred the look and feel of the prequels. Now I prefer the look and feel of the original trilogy. But I think that's just because I've watched them all cinema. Back when I used to rewatch the prequels continually, over and over again, that's because those are the only films I watched. And I never really gravitated to watching A New Hope, to the point that about 5 years ago now, I watched this film on Christmas Eve, and it was almost like I was watching it for the first time, I had this completely new perspective on it. So, like what I said, over the past couple of years, well, over time, my liking of this film has gone up quite a lot, and there's so much I love about the film. You know, so much I love about the context of the movie. Like, when this film came out in 1977, it was a one-of-a-kind type of film, because before this you had movies like Chinatown, like The Sugarland Express, like The Godfather, like The Conversation, like Taxi Driver, very good movies, but you had those sort of films which were reflecting what was going on in America at the time, because in America at the time you had the end of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, if I'm not mistaken, ended in 1975, and you also had the civil rights movements going on, and you had quite a lot happening in America which was being reflected in the films made around the time. Honestly, if you watch any American film from like the 60s or the 70s, you can really get how political they're reflecting what is going on. How you can really, what I'm trying to say, you can really, you really understand how they're reflecting the times that they were made. They're very much products of their time. And the original Star Wars film is as well. I mean, George Lucas has always said that this original Star Wars movie was an allegory for the Vietnam War. But if you didn't know that, you could just watch the film and escape into this galaxy. You know, I remember watching the documentary on Disney Plus. I think it's called Empire of Dreams, the making of the original Star Wars trilogy. It's named something like that, and I may have misremembered the name, but you get the point I'm making. It's called something like Empire of Dreams, and I remember people talking about the release of this movie in that documentary and talking about how much it meant to them. And the same when I watched the docuseries Light and Magic, all about ILM, the special effects company that worked on this movie, that was literally created for this film, and that ended up working on the other, well, on all of George Lucas's Star Wars movies. In fact, they might still work on the Star Wars stuff today, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that's how the docuseries ended. It basically showed that ILM was still working on TV shows like The Mandalorian and like Obi-Wan and so on and so on. But ILM, which was like George Lucas's special effects company, that's basically what it was. You learn in that docuseries about how influential the original Star Wars movie was. Like, there's a little bit of that docuseries where you see Ron Howard, who's now become this very good director, but he wasn't a very good director back then. He was probably more known for starring in the likes of Happy Days, you know. He talks about going to the original Star Wars movie, and he actually worked with George Lucas on American Graffiti before this. So, yeah, because Ron Howard, one of the stars. In fact, he may even be the star of American Graffiti, though I'm not sure if you'd say American Graffiti actually has a protagonist. But anyway, that's another topic for another day. He'd worked with George Lucas before, and he heard that the original Star Wars wasn't going to be good from George Lucas himself. And he went to go and watch it, and he was like, as soon as he walked out of the cinema, he went, I want to go back in and rewatch it. And hearing all these stories about how influential this film was and how different it was to any other movie releasing around this time, I think, around the time that it was released, I think it's just fascinating. I mean, I wish I was around in the 70s to experience the release of this film, to experience the build-up to this movie, because, again, from the sounds of it, nobody really expected to be anything special. If you watch the documentary, Empire of Dreams, people are talking about how they were, you know, they thought their careers had ended because they'd worked on this film. You know, Alec Guinness often speaks about how he never really enjoyed working on the Star Wars movies. Harrison Ford has spoke about at length that he never really enjoyed doing the Star Wars movies, and he came back to do The Force Awakens because, well, I think he got a shit ton of money. So you hear all these stories about how everybody behind the scenes thought this movie was going to be terrible. George Lucas himself, who wrote and directed this movie, and who, because he wrote and directed this film, became one of the most important and influential filmmakers of all time, thought this movie was going to crash and burn, because when you watch, I can't remember which documentary it was, I think it was Empire of Dreams where he said this, although it may have been Light and Magic. He may have said it in both, actually. That's maybe why I'm getting the memory a bit mixed up, but I remember watching him in an interview, where he was talking about how the original Star Wars movie wasn't what he wanted it to be. The sets didn't live up to his imagination, and the costume designs didn't live up to his imagination, which is, funny to watch him say that, because you watch the movie and like, wow, the set designs are unearthly, like they should be. The costume design is unlike anything you've ever seen before. But you hear him talking about it, and you hear him talking about how depressed he was making this film. And it's funny watching all of that now, because it comes out and it makes people's lives, hearing all these stories about, and watching all these movie pundits online who are big Star Wars fans talking about the impact that the original Star Wars movie had on them is so, again, fascinating to watch. Because I had that experience with The Phantom Menace. I never had that experience with A New Hope. And hearing about, people's experience going to watch this film in 1977 at the cinema, not knowing what to expect, then coming out the cinema and their lives had been completely turned upside down. Again, it's going back to that word. It's fascinating. And I really wish I was around in the 70s to experience that. I really wish I was around in the 70s to experience Star Wars for the first time, because growing up, I realised how much Star Wars was ingrained in pop culture. That's the thing, the original Star Wars movies, and most of the Star Wars prequels as well, had already released by the time I'd watched The Phantom Menace. So growing up, I knew about Star Wars. I knew what it was. I didn't have the same experience most people probably had when they watched the original Star Wars movie for the first time, when I watched The Phantom Menace for the first time, because I already knew Star Wars exists. It was so ingrained into pop culture, I'd heard people talking about it at school before I watched the film. I knew about what it was, but I wish I could have been around in the 70s to not know what it was, to really, go to cinema for the first time and experience this, and have this movie, take a hold on my life. But I never had that. And I feel to truly love this film the way so many people do, you had to have been around in 1977 when this film came out. And I wasn't. And maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there'll be people my age who watch A New Hope and it had that effect on them. But I feel for you to think that it's one of the best films of all time, you had to, and maybe even the best film of all time, you had to have been around in 1977 to have that experience, and for the film to hit you in that right way, in that way that just worked. And I never really had that with A New Hope, because it was a 4 Star Wars movie I watched. The first time I watched it, I didn't have that experience. Like, oh my god, this is unlike anything I've seen before, because I'd seen the Star Wars prequel trilogy. I was more, again, confused about what I was experiencing, and that's another reason I don't love this film, because it was clearly never intended to have sequels. Like, I know George Lucas, and I love George Lucas, I don't know where my life would be without him. Just look behind me, look at the t-shirt I'm wearing today. I don't know where my life would be without George Lucas. But the thing is, I know George Lucas, after the original Star Wars movie came out, I said, oh yes, it was always intended to have sequels, and it was always intended to be a 9-part saga. And while I believe him to a degree. I believe when he got into Empire Strikes Back, that was his intention. I don't believe it was his intention when he was making A New Hope. I think when he was making A New Hope, he just wanted to get it out there. If you watch any documentary or read any book on him, on the making of the original Star Wars movie, it sounds like it was just production hell, which I'm going to talk about in more detail a bit later on in this review. But the thing is, I don't think it was ever intended to have sequels. So when you watch this movie, I do scratch my head in a couple of moments, and I'm like, yeah, I wish this had more of a... I wish this had a better setup for sequels, so that I could think... So that I would... What am I trying to say? I don't know what I'm trying to say today. My head's a bit all over the place if you can't already tell. But that's what hay fever does to you, But when I was watching this movie the other day, that's what I'm trying to say. When I was watching the movie for the first time in a couple of years the other day, I couldn't help but think, imagine if this was the Fellowship of the Ring of the Star Wars trilogy, of the original Star Wars trilogy, and I don't feel it's quite as good as Fellowship of the Ring. Like, I think the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, is the perfect start to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Especially the extended edition, which beautifully sets up all these character arcs for the rest of the trilogy. And once you've seen the trilogy as a whole, once you've seen Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, and you rewatch those movies, it all perfectly lines up. Fellowship perfectly and beautifully sets up Two Towers and Return of the King. Whilst I don't think A New Hope does the best job at setting up an Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, I think it does a fine job, but I think it was never intended to have sequels, to the point that the Imperial March, which is Darth Vader's theme, bom 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 ba-dum bom ba-dum, the theme which everybody associates with, Darth Vader, one of the most iconic screen villains of all time, the theme everybody associates with the Empire, the villainous force that we see in this movie for the first time, wasn't created for the character until the second movie. And I think if George Lucas intended for this film to be the first part in a 3-part trilogy, you would have had the Imperial March in there in Vader's introduction. Instead, when you get Vader's introduction in the movie, it's very good, but you don't get the Imperial March. You just have boom, ba boom. It's something like that. I don't remember the musical cue quite note by note, but it's something like that. The point I'm making is you don't get the Imperial March. You don't hear the iconic Darth Vader's theme. And there's other instances like that in the film, like, other moments where you can clearly tell this was not intended to have sequels. Like at the end of the movie, when Han and Luke are getting their medals for defeating the Empire, you get to Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and you're like, wait, why were they awarded medals at the end of the film? And why was the end of A New Hope, or why was everyone smiling at the end? And why was everyone smiling at the end of A New Hope and celebrating in this ceremony with this triumphant John Williams musical score going in the background? Bom, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, bom, 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 ba-da-bum. It's a great piece of music, but why were we celebrating there when you get to Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and you realise that the Empire was far from defeated at the end of A New Hope? Plus, another way you can tell that this film wasn't setting up the sequels was the final battle. The final battle with the trench run is excellent. It's so well edited. It's some of the best filmmaking I have seen in a movie period. The way it's cutting between these three storylines of Leia on Yavin 4, Luke in the X-Wing using the Force to get that right shot at the right moment, to Grand Moff Tarkin in the Death Star, and he's just about to fire on Yavin 4, but then the Death Star blows up. It's one of the best editing, it's some of the best editing I've seen in any movie, period. It's simply iconic, and it's iconic for a reason. That being said, when you watch Rogue One, and I did talk about this a little bit in my review of Rogue One, you're like, well, why is the space battle in Rogue One so much bigger than the space battle in this movie? And why is the space battle in Return of the Jedi so much bigger than the space battle in this film? And the simple answer is because I think George Lucas wanted to end the story with the Empire. Like, I know Vader survives before people start coming at me in the comments. Vader survives, so actually, setting up that the Empire's going to come back. I know that happens, but I think if George Lucas thought at the time when he was making this movie that it was going to make sequels, I don't think he would have blown up the Death Star, because otherwise, why did he bring the Death Star back in the third film in the trilogy? Just saying, and yet he blows up the Death Star. He decided to blow up the Death Star at the end of this movie in a battle, in a space battle that looks quite, compared to the space battle in Rogue One and compared to the space battle in Return of the Jedi, is actually quite small. It's an excellent space battle. It's so enjoyable to watch. And the moment where Han Solo comes in to save the day and the musical score, boom, boom, boom. I mean, I'm not going to try and sing it, but you get the point I'm making. That moment I love to pieces, and I love that section of the movie. I think it's brilliant. I'm not saying it's bad, but I think that section of the movie is also showing that this movie wasn't intended to be wasn't intended to have sequels. And I think there are plenty of other instances of that. And I think, for me personally, if this movie had more setup for Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, the same way Fellowship of the Ring beautifully sets up Two Towers and Return of the King, I would have preferred it. But instead, I think the Lord of the Rings trilogy is the ultimate trilogy, the best trilogy of all time, because it has that setup in the first film, and it beautifully and just, perfectly introduces his audience into the world of Middle-earth. And, has all this incredible world building as well that's done in the space of one movie. Even when you watch the theatrical cut of Fellowship of the Ring, all that magnificent world building for one movie is still there, but you don't get all that magnificent world building in this movie. You're told at the start of the film, and the iconic title card a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that this film is set in a galaxy far, far away. But I would argue after you watch A New Hope, you don't get to feel this is a galaxy. You get to see what? 3 planets? 4 if you count the Death Star as a planet. It's a planet killer, but 4 if you count the Death Star. But one planet you don't really get to explore, that's Old One. You get to see Tatooine, okay, you get to see quite a bit of Tatooine. And you get Yavin 4, though Yavin 4 is a moon. But, same differences in the Star Wars franchise. But that's really it. And I feel like, well, if this film made the galaxy feel more like a galaxy, then it would have set up the sequels. And I know this is probably going to sound like a petty reason to not love the film, but it's one of the reasons I much prefer Fellowship of the Ring over this movie, because, going back onto what I was saying, I think Fellowship of the Ring does a far better job at setting up the next 2 movies in that trilogy, whilst I think this film doesn't do the best job at setting up the next 2 films in the trilogy, and instead feels more self-contained, and I personally don't love that. I personally don't love how you can tell this film was not intended to have sequels. And if it was, if George Lucas was telling the truth from the beginning that this film was actually he intended this film to have sequels as soon as he came up with the idea, then I don't think he did a great job setting up the sequels at that. But again, going back onto that whole thing I was saying before, even though I don't love this film, there is so much I love about it. So much I love about the context of the movie, that ILM was created essentially for this film. If I understand what was said in the docuseries Light and Magic correctly, ILM was created for this film. A group of people who had worked in special effects before. George Lucas got them to work on this movie, and that was people like Joe Johnston, who's gone on to direct some really, big films, with the likes of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, Jurassic Park 3. I think he directed the first Captain America movie. He's gone on to do some big things, and I think he did the storyboarding and worked on the special effects for the original Star Wars movie. And if I remember correctly, there is something in the docuseries Light and Magic about how he didn't know anything about storyboarding before he came to work on this film. John Dykstra, I think that's how you pronounce his name, he came in and did something to the special effects for this movie. He ensembled the special effects team. Dennis Muren, who has worked on the special effects for so many classics, he worked on the special effects for this film. And all the special effects team that came together to make this movie. And the pressure they were under, because, as I've already briefly mentioned early on in this review, I heard this story about, it was in the docuseries Light and Magic, about how it was 6 months before New Hope released, and George Lucas had been shooting the film, and he went to see how the special effects were doing, and they only had like 3 or 4 special effects shots. And this film has a lot of special effects shots. They hadn't done the trench run sequence, which is so iconic, and they had then this short amount of time to do all the special effects shots for this movie, and you just watch it and you go, wow, you can't believe that they only had 6 months to make the special effects for the movie, but they did, and they really did a magnificent job doing so, to the point that, correct me if I'm mistaken, they won an Academy Award for the special effects for this movie, and understandably so. I think ILM the special effects team that worked on this film and then later went to work on Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first three Indiana Jones films, the Star Wars prequels, and I think many other films, including like Willow, which George Lucas was also involved in, was so integral to this film, and God knows what the film would have been like without them. God knows what this film would have been like without, George Lucas' ex-wife, his wife at the time that this film released, who came in last minute and re-edited the opening of the film. I mean, I'm not going to go into too much detail there because I don't actually know much about that myself, but I've heard all these stories about, Marcia Lucas, I think that's what her name is, coming in last minute to re-edit significant sections of A New Hope to make it work. I love all the stories going back on to before, how, most people involved in the production of this movie thought it was going to turn out terribly. No one had faith in it. And then it became one of the highest grossing movies. Actually became the highest grossing movie of all time when it released. It surpassed... it's suppressed. Is it surpassed or suppressed? It's suppressed. Yeah, it's suppressed. It's suppressed. Got it right there. It's suppressed. Jaws, the movie that literally invented the word blockbuster because people came around the block to watch the movie. There you go. He literally surpassed Jaws, which came out 2 years before, as the highest grossing movie of all time. And there's a reason for that, because the movie touched people in a way that no other movie really has. But again, go back onto that thing, because it wasn't the first Star Wars movie I watched, and because I already knew Star Wars was a thing before I watched my first Star Wars movie, I didn't have that experience, and so, I don't feel that same appreciation for it and that same love for it that so many people do. And like I said before, I feel you had to have been around in the 70s to really get that. But again, I love the context around this movie. And there are things in the movie itself which I love quite a lot. I mean, I have to talk about the John Williams musical score. I just have to talk about it. It wouldn't be a Star Wars review without me talking about the musical score. What is there to say about the John Williams musical score to this movie that hasn't already been said? It's perfect. I mean, I don't know where my life would be if John Williams didn't compose the musical score to this movie. I'm being completely honest there, because John Williams has been such an integral part of my life. I spoke about this. I think I spoke about this in all of my previous Star Wars film reviews, apart from my review of Rogue One, because he didn't do the musical score to Rogue One, of course. But John Williams has been such an integral part of my life because growing up I used to listen to the Star Wars music. I didn't realise it was by him until a certain point, and then I started to realise that John Williams had composed all of my favourite films. The Indiana Jones films, the first two Jurassic Park movies, E.T., Jaws, and so on and so on and so on. He basically composed the music to my childhood, and Star Wars was a big part of my childhood and still is a big part of me now. And to hear in the documentary Empire Dreams that they almost went with an 80s sort of 80s synthesized musical score to this movie, because that's how a lot of musical scores around that time were sounding, scared me a little. I was like, oh my god, they almost didn't have that grand orchestral musical score sound for this movie. They almost went with an sort of 80s style, or, in the case of this movie, 70s style musical score for this film. Again, it scares me. I like, thank God that they didn't. Thank God that they went with an orchestral musical score for this movie, because the musical score to this film, I mean, it's one of the most influential musical scores of all time, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason that it's one of the most influential and one of the most iconic musical scores of all time, and that's because, well, the themes in this film are they're just perfect. John Williams adds life to this movie, because people say this about Jaws. Spielberg, who directed Jaws, says this about Jaws. He says, where would Jaws be without the John Williams musical score, you know, bum 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 bum, you know, that was my terrible rendition of the Jaws theme. He says that about Jaws, and I feel it even more so with Star Wars. I mean, I agree with Spielberg about Jaws. Where would Jaws be without the John Williams musical score? But I would also argue that the musical score is even more important to Star Wars, to the original Star Wars movie, than it is to the first Jaws film, because the music to the original Star Wars movie adds life to this movie. I mean, there's so many scenes which are just, you know, which are just made so much better because of the musical score. Like the binary sunset, Luke looking onto the binary sunset, dreaming of getting away from this farm on Tatooine that he's living at with his aunt and his uncle. That scene, without the musical score, is okay. It's not bad. But with the musical score, it conveys so much more emotions when you hear the Force theme for the first time, you know. Bum bum ba da dum bum 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 bum. There's a reason that scene is so iconic and has been parodied so many times. You know, to the point that I remember watching the Family Guy Star Wars parody of this film. And I've never been a big fan of Family Guy, but I did enjoy their Star Wars parodies. I remember watching, their Star Wars, the Family Guy Star Wars stuff. And during the moment where Luke is looking onto the sunset, and Luke is played by Chris in the Family Guy Star Wars. Chris turns to the camera and goes, "Ladies and gentlemen, the John Williams musical score," because it's such an important part of that scene. And again, it conveys so many emotions, and so much of the score does that. And this was the movie where all the iconic Star Wars music that has been used so many times in Star Wars movies, and that sort of music where you hear and you just know it's from Star Wars comes from. It's where the original Star Wars theme came from. It's where the Force theme came from that I tried to sing about a minute ago now. It's where Princess Leia's theme came from, which is simply one of the most beautifully poignant pieces of music I have ever listened to. Every time I hear Princess Leia's theme used in a Star Wars movie, I almost want to cry. And that was before Carrie Fisher passed away, because I think it's perfect. It truly is. Right, so this is a quick little add-on, something I forgot to mention when I was initially recording this podcast, but something I had to mention in this podcast, so I'm putting it in here so it counts. I love in the John Williams musical score how you get the Cantina band that plays jazz music. That's genius. The rest of the musical score is orchestral, exciting, uplifting themes, and conveys so many emotions, That's what the musical score really does to this movie. I don't think the rest of the film does a great job conveying all those emotions, but the musical score does an absolutely magnificent job. There's a magnifique, I can't pronounce trying to pronounce the French version magnificent and I failed miserably there, but you get the point of making. It does an absolutely magnificent job at conveying all these emotions, and then you get to the cantina scene in the film and there's jazz music playing. Genius. There's just so much in the musical score where you're like, how did John Williams do it? How did he just know to come up with these themes, and how did he make them sound so brilliant? And how did he just add life to the film and the musical score? And I think the simple answer is because he's a genius. And I think if anyone says that John Williams isn't a genius, just make them watch A New Hope, and then make them watch the film with the sound off, and see how they think about the film then. I think it'll be a completely different movie. And the end credits theme as well, bum ba-dum ba-dum ba-da-ba-da bum ba-dum ba-da bum bum ba-ba-da-bum bum. This was the first time that theme was used, and just thinking about that, it's like, God, where would my childhood be without the score to this movie? Where would my childhood be if John Williams didn't compose a musical score to this film? It's a question I don't know asking. It's a question, luckily, I don't really have to ask. I don't have to answer, because he did do the musical score, and I think he made this film so much better in the musical score. And there's so many things in the film itself. There's so many other things in the film that I love as well. For instance, I think it's a very bold decision how the film starts off. How we don't actually meet any human characters in the movie until like the 20-minute mark where we first meet Luke Skywalker. And up to that point, all we're doing is following two droids. One looks like a dustbin. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love R2-D2. Love him to pieces, but let's be real, he looks like a dustbin. And I can't imagine, the executives watching this movie and thinking, why are we just following droids for the first 20 minutes in this film? Why have we not met any human characters yet? Because that's what happens, we just follow droids for the first 20 minutes of this film, the first 20 minutes of this film, and I think that's such a bold choice. I also think it's a very bold choice that you never actually get to see under Vader's mask throughout the entirety of this movie. Well, throughout the entirety of this film and Empire Strikes Back. You never really get to see the villain, and yet you feel his power. You feel his force even. Every single time he comes into the room, he has this dominance. And I love the way so many scenes play out in this film. Like, I love when Luke Skywalker is talking to old Ben Kenobi about who Anakin Skywalker was. And there's this moment in that scene where Ben Kenobi makes his face. It's only a small moment where Alec Guinness as Ben Kenobi makes his face. And it's only a small moment in the scene, but after watching the prequels, it holds so much more meaning. And I love the way Han Solo's introduced. He's like, oh, you guys want my ship and it's the best ship in the galaxy. You have to pay a lot of money for you guys to come on my ship. And he doesn't say that, obviously. I badly paraphrase what he said, but I love how we introduced to him. And then, as soon as old Ben and Luke walk away from meeting Han Solo and agree to his price to fly on his ship, Han Solo turns to Chewie and goes, oh my god, these guys must really need to get out of here because these guys must really be desperate. You can just tell that he's tricked them. And I love that introduction because just like that, you know what sort of character he is. And I think the character of Han Solo and the way he's played by Harrison Ford is perfect in this movie. I mean, he's perfect, and I love how Carrie Fisher plays Princess Leia in this film, and I really don't think Princess Leia would be the iconic character she is if she wasn't played by Carrie Fisher, the late great Carrie Fisher, who really made the role her own. And I mean, yeah, every time she's on screen, she commands your attention, and there's a reason she's often considered one of the, if not the most important female characters in cinema history, one of the most influential female characters in cinema history. I think she is perfect in the film. And again, there's so much that I love about it. The set design is fantastic. I love all the costume design. I love watching this now, and you see all those iconic moments, like does Han or Greedo shoot first? The trench run sequence, the scene where we first meet old Ben Kenobi. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. The introduction of the film where Leia is giving the message to R2-D2, and actually I just remembered there, I contradicted myself actually. Yeah, because I got it wrong earlier. I said you don't actually meet any human characters until the 20-minute mark of the movie. That's a lie. You meet Leia in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the film. Well, you meet Leia quite early on, actually. You meet Leia within the first 5 minutes of the film. But you don't follow her until much later on. You don't actually get to see her interactions with Vader and with Grand Moff Tarkin, which is so great to watch, by the way. You don't get to see them until later on in the movie. And you do follow C-3PO and R2-D2, just them two characters, for a long time before, well, it feels like for a bit of time before you meet any other human character in the movie. And yeah, there's so much in the film itself which I really, really really truly adore, you know? Like how they had Alec Guinness and Peter Cushing, they're two, in this movie, and they were the two biggest stars at the time, but they didn't have them as the main characters. They had them as supporting characters, and I think that's such a genius choice, and I think there's a great chemistry between the main three stars, and I thought it was so much fun to watch, but I still just don't love the film itself, because every time I finish it, I'm like, it just doesn't quite hit that mark for me. The same way that Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi hit that mark for me. When I watch both of those films, I'm just completely absorbed by it. I'm completely absorbed by Empire Strikes Back. I'm completely absorbed by Return of the Jedi. And I'm just so into those movies. And with A New Hope, I'm not saying I find the film boring at all, but there are parts of it where I just can't help but think, if this movie came out now, imagine how many people would be criticising it to death. Because this is what annoys me about when people criticise Disney Star Wars stuff. Listen, I got my own problems with Disney Star Wars. I don't think all the content they've released has been brilliant at all. I don't think all the content they've released has been that good, if I'm being completely honest. I think some of it's been brilliant, but some of it's also not been that good. But I do feel like some people are too hypercritical of Disney Star Wars nowadays. When, listen, people might not like me saying this, but it's the truth. The original Star Wars movie has some problems. It may be perfect in your eyes, and that's completely fair. I think Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade is a perfect movie to me. But I also understand that that film has its problems. And you can think A New Hope is a perfect movie, sure. But you also understand, you've also got to understand that it does have its problems here and there, For instance, the Obi-Wan and Vader duel in this movie. Imagine if this film came out now, imagine if this film released after Revenge of the Sith, and you see Anakin and Obi-Wan's duel in that movie, which is so exhilarating to watch, which is so heart-pounding to watch, and then you get to Vader and Obi-Wan's duel in this movie, I'm sorry, what happened? This became much worse at dueling, wielding lightsabers. That's what I was trying to say there. This became much worse at wielding lightsabers. I mean, there's one point in the duel where Obi-Wan literally just does a twist on the spot and Vader doesn't strike him down. You're like, I'm sorry, this is a bad duel. It just is. Compared to the lightsaber duels in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, say all about those movies, but the prequel trilogy always had great duels. This duel is not on that same par. And yeah, you can tell. Also, why does Obi-Wan disappear as soon as he's been hit with a lightsaber? As soon as he's been as soon as he gets struck down, why does he just disappear? That's never really made sense to me, if I'm being completely honest. Also, as I've already mentioned before, at the end of the film, everyone's all smiles and they're getting medals, and then you watch the sequels, you watch Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, why were they all smiling and getting medals at the end of A New Hope? Because they hadn't defeated the Death Star. Why? When we get our first introduction to Mos Eisley, and you get there's no greater place where you'll find scum and villainy. Somebody said, Obi-Wan says a line like that. It's an iconic moment in the film. But why, when we get our first introduction to Mos Eisley, we see our main characters stood on a cliff just looking at it from afar. They don't move from this cliff. They just stand there for 2 minutes. And they don't move. It's they're actually going to walk there. That's one of the things I really love about Fellowship of the Ring. You introduce a new location, and then you see our main characters walking to that location. But you don't get that in this movie. It's another reason I prefer Fellowship of the Ring over this film, because when they introduce a new location, you feel like you are experiencing that location. You feel like you're getting to that location alongside our main characters. Whilst when we get introduced to Mos Eisley in this film, we're we're just going to stand there and look at it? When are we going to go over there? And also, after the prequel trilogy, why doesn't Obi-Wan recognise C-3PO when he sees him in this film? And I know there have been some very well edited Star Wars theory videos talking about why Obi-Wan doesn't recognise R2-D2 and C-3PO when he sees him in this film. But I don't want to have to watch, again, a very well edited video in order to understand something that's just inconsistent with the prequel trilogy, which George Lucas also directed. You know, after watching the prequel trilogy, there were some problems with this film. Actually, there's quite a few problems. And for a film that's apparently set in this galaxy, why does it feel so small? You know, like I said before, you only see, like, what, 4 planets in this movie? I think it's 4 if you count the Death Star. And then it's meant to be this galaxy. And imagine if this film came out now. People would be going, oh, well, it's a galaxy. And we don't get to see more to this galaxy. We only get to see 4 planets. And, like, I've just basically criticised the film for already. It doesn't actually feel like a galaxy. That's what people be saying. If the film came out now, if you don't believe me, I'm sorry, but it's the truth. If this film came out now, people would be tearing it apart. But they don't. Because it's a product of its time. It's a film which came out at the right time for people, hit them in the sweet spot, and worked with them. Oh my god, I feel like I'm about to sneeze anymore. It's what hay fever is doing to me right now. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, people don't criticise it though, because it holds such a special place in their heart. And that's fine. That's completely understandable. I get it. I love so much the context around this movie, and if only I was there in 1977 to experience this movie for the first time, but I wasn't. However, you've got to also understand that some people, such as myself, do still want to enjoy Star Wars, and we don't watch Star Wars for it to be literally nitpicked moment by moment, because that's not Star Wars. Star Wars has had problems from the beginning. Let's not pretend it hasn't. The narrative to this film is incredibly predictable. Like, people have been criticising the narrative to The Acolyte, which is coming out at the moment, or might have ended by the time that this podcast is released. Although, and I don't think I've reviewed it on this channel yet, I should say. I will get around to reviewing it at some point. But people have been criticising the Acolyte for its narrative, and it's understandable criticism. But let's not pretend the narrative in Star Wars has always been Shakespeare. You know, let's not pretend the narrative in Star Wars has always been on the level of, say, The Godfather, or on the level of many cinematic classics. Now, let's not pretend this is a particularly deep and meaningful film. I mean, it is a meaningful movie, but let's not pretend it's as complex and as deep as I've already mentioned The Godfather, or The Godfather Part 2 even, because it's not. And yet people look at Star Wars today, and I understand why they do, because these are the people who watched A New Hope when they were kids for the first time, and they're now about 40 or 50 years old. But they watch Star Wars now, and they're like, well, why isn't it more complex? I'm like, because that's not what Star Wars ever was. When you watch the original Star Wars movie, and guys, I enjoy this film as well, but when you watch it, listen, it's got problems. It may be a perfect film to you. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, it's a perfect film to me. But I can also watch that film and I can sit there and go, yeah, like, there was a underground sort of temple in a sewer in Venice and nobody realised it. Okay, that was a little unbelievable. You know, the problems in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, I don't understand it there, but I just get over them because it's a perfect film to me. And if this is a perfect film to you, then understand why I might just ignore the problems. But let's not pretend that they're not there. And let's not pretend that Star Wars hasn't always had problems, because it has. And it does really frustrate me when I try to just enjoy Star Wars nowadays. And I try to get the best out of it, and then I go online after a new episode of a Star Wars TV show has dropped, or after a new Star Wars film has come out, which hasn't happened in about 5 years now, but still, it did happen back from like 2017 onwards with all the Last Jedi discourse, and I see people just tearing apart this new Star Wars content bit by bit, and I'm like, guys, you could do the same with the original trilogy and you'd find loads of problems. Why are we treating these movies any differently? I don't really get it. So yeah, basically, I think what I'm saying in the end is, listen, I understand people think this is the greatest movie of all time. I watched this documentary about this movie, about all the background extras to this film. And people who only literally appeared in one frame of the movie, and they go to these Comic Cons and people pay hundreds of pounds to get pictures with them because of how much this film means to them. But let's also not pretend that this is a completely and utterly perfect film with no problems. Because, especially with the sequels and prequels, there are problems with the film. There are. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. That all being said, though, I do really enjoy the film. And guess what? I've enjoyed the remastered version. That's, as far as I remember, always been the version which I watched. I've never seen the original theatrical cut. And I probably will one day. But I have seen the original theatrical cut to Return of the Jedi, and I have seen the original theatrical cut to Empire Strikes Back, which really isn't that different to the remastered version. But, I like the remastered version to this film quite a lot. I mean, apart from the Jabba the Hutt scene, that is another problem with this film. The Jabba the Hutt scene, which people say, oh no, people who might be commenting going, actually, no, this film does, I criticised earlier, this film doesn't set up the sequels. It doesn't set up Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. And I can already hear and see people commenting, people shouting at their screens wherever you're watching or listening to the podcast going, actually, no, you're wrong. You're wrong, Spike. This film does actually set up Return of the Jedi because in the remastered version, there's a Jabba the Hutt scene. But the Jabba the Hutt scene is just awful. Okay, it may set up Return of the Jedi, I'll give you that. But it's an awful scene. And I think it's only on the remastered version, but it's so bad. Because there's one bit in the scene where Han Solo walks over Jabba's sort of tail. He walks over Jabba, essentially. And you're like, but the way he's done, that clearly wasn't what Harrison Ford was doing originally. Because, if people didn't know already, Jabba the Hutt was originally this person. It was originally human. But then they changed that when he got to Return of the Jedi. But the remastered versions came out in 1997 after Return of the Jedi released. And because it was made after, because the remastered stuff was made, the remastered additions to these movies were made after Return of the Jedi, George Lucas decided to add in the Jabba the Hutt scene. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work. It just doesn't. Even to the point at the end of that scene, Boba Fett literally turns to the camera. It's almost like there should be a title card underneath that says, Boba Fett will return. Like you get at the very end, at the end of the credits of Marvel movies nowadays. It's almost like you expect it to come up there. Boba Fett will return because he's in Empire Strikes Back and he's in Return of the Jedi. So, yeah, I don't think that the Jabba the Hutt scene is particularly great. But I do like the remastered stuff. I like how it makes a lot of the special effects feel more in line with the special effects to the prequel trilogy. But just, there's a feel to this film which I think is very 70s. And I don't get that from Empire Strikes Back. Partly because it wasn't made in the 70s, it was made in 1980. But when I watch Empire Strikes Back, I can't speak, I've been going on for that long. When I watch Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, I don't think, these are movies which were clearly made in the 80s. I think those are timeless. Whilst I'm being completely honest here, and I'm not saying the film is dated or anything, but I think A New Hope feels like a movie that was made in the 70s. It was made in the late 70s at that. And again, I wish I was around in the 1970s, in 1977 even, to experience this movie for the first time and go, wow, I haven't seen anything like that. But I wasn't. I watched this after I watched Revenge of the Sith, and I was like, I have seen something like that though, and it I didn't feel it was as good as Revenge of the Sith back then. And listen, I think it's better than Revenge of the Sith now, for sure. But I just don't love it as much as I want to. And I think the three big reasons are, like I've already mentioned, I feel you had to have been around in the late 70s to really love the movie and view it as the best movie of all time, like so many people do. And I think after watching the prequels and after watching this franchise for so long, it is an odd experience, as it clearly wasn't intended as a franchise starter, regardless of what George Lucas may say. And I do often feel like I love the context of the film more than the film itself, because this film had production hell. They've already spoken about. The special effects weren't done when George Lucas wanted them to be done. He was really disappointed in the special effects department, to the point that they had to do the special effects, so many of the iconic special effects, in a space of about 6 months. How George Lucas wasn't happy with this film at all, and people involved in the film thought it was going to ruin their careers. And you often realise, I have now, particularly somebody who is really into exploring the context surrounding so many iconic movies, how many iconic films had production hells, had these terrible productions. For instance, Back to the Future famously had a troubled production where they changed the star like 2 weeks into filming or something like that. It may even be longer. They changed the star and they're trying to film around Michael J. Fox's schedule when he was filming on the TV show Family Ties, if I remember correctly. The Godfather famously had a troubled production where Francis Ford Coppola was apparently fighting for every single shot in that movie. There's other big examples. Jaws, that famously had a troubled production where they could never get the shark working that they were using for the shark in the film. And again, there are so many examples, and I just picked on 3 there. But there's, like the point I'm making is, I love how often the most important and influential movies of all time had troubled productions, and A New Hope is no different. And that's another thing I really love about it. But again, it's a bit of context in the movie. It's not the movie itself. I enjoy watching this movie, but I don't come away from it going, every single moment just had me hooked and had me in complete awe the same way every single moment in Empire Strikes Back with Return of the Jedi do. And I think it's just because this wasn't my first Star Wars movie in the end. There's so much that I love about it. Bloody hell. Some loud beeping going on outside there. I wonder if the camera picked up, so sorry for that sound interference. But I do love so many aspects of the film. So many of the classic lines of dialogue where when I watch this film now, I smile and when I hear them, I felt a great disturbance in the force as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. I feared something terrible has happened after Obi-Wan has been blown up by the Death Star. And Obi-Wan says that line, that I just said. When you first see Mos Eisley when you first see Mos Eisley on Tatooine, and Obi-Wan says, "You'll never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy." That was a quote I was trying to say earlier in this review. I should have just looked at my notes instead of trying to remember the quote and paraphrasing it badly. But still, I said it there, so it counts. Darth Vader saying, "The Force is unusually strong with this one when chasing after Luke's X-Wing in the trench run." Leia saying, "You're a little short for a stormtrooper," when she first sees Luke. Han showing up to save Luke in the final battle. And I love all that stuff in the film because it's so ingrained into the pop culture zeitgeist. So that stuff all makes me smile. And there's so much to this film that makes me smile, but I just don't love it, as I keep saying. And I really wish that I did. Listen, if you did, and if you think what I'm saying is absolutely crazy, go ahead and go at me in the comment section below. I love it when people do. But I'm just being completely honest. I'd rather be honest than lie in these reviews. And that's one of the reasons I've redone my Star Wars reviews, because I didn't feel I got them right to begin with, and I didn't feel like I was completely honest with myself. And that was particularly the case with A New Hope, where I did my review of that film the first time on this channel, like in 2019, before Rise of Skywalker released. In the lead up to Rise of Skywalker, And I felt I lied to myself. I felt in that review I kept saying, yeah, I love this film. It's brilliant. Oh, I love everything about it and everything like that. But I don't. You know, I just don't. But I do love what it made, though. I love that this was the film which started off the Star Wars phenomenon. And I do find it an absolute joy to watch. It is so... I completely get it why this is considered one of the most important films of all time, one of the most influential movies of all time, and why it's up there, you know, in IMDb's top 10 films of all time, or in Empire's top 10 films of all time. Whenever an outlet, a news outlet, or a website does top 10 movies of all time, I completely get why this movie's in there. I get all that, and I love that people love this movie so much. But I don't. But I still think it's great, and without a doubt deserves a place in the Hall of Fame of cinema, you know? So yeah, that's why I'm going to say that Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, I'm going to say that it's I'm going to give it a 7.8 out of 10. Actually, no, scratch that. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 because I do think it's great. Usually I give films an 8 out of 10 if I love them. And I don't love this movie, as I keep saying, as I've said about 1,000 times in this review. Honestly, I sound like a broken record, don't I? But I don't love this movie. So you might be questioning, why are you giving it an 8 out of 10 then? And the simple answer is because I love what it did. And I love everything surrounding it. And I love that without this film, and I love that without this movie, no, but that doesn't make sense. I love that this movie gave us a Star Wars franchise. That's what I'm trying to say. I love all the iconic moments, but again, it's just something about it where it just doesn't quite work for me the same way, say, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring does. Because that movie to me, I think, is a perfect introduction to the world of Middle-earth. Whilst this movie, I don't feel is a perfect introduction to the Star Wars franchise. But that's just me. I still admire this film greatly. And I still love so much about it. You know, the John Williams musical score. Need I say more? I love so much about it. I just don't love it, you know. But there we go. That's my thoughts on Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And so, all in all, as I've already said, and as I'm going to say once more in this podcast today, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope is a 7.5 out of 10 from me. Anyway, guys, that's it for today's podcast. We have seen Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope, and I'd be surprised if you hadn't and you watched it at this point in this review. Then please let me know your thoughts on the film in the comment section below. Maybe you do think it's one of the best films of all time, and maybe you think everything I've said in this review is absolute nonsense. And if that's the case, please let me know why in the comment section below. Or maybe you actually kind of agree with me. Whatever your thoughts are, please let me know in the comment section below. And look forward to my review of Empire Strikes Back coming very, very soon on this channel. I say very, very soon. Will probably be a bit of time now. I know my reviews of Rogue One and A New Hope will come out quite close to one another. But, you know, you might have to wait a little bit of time now for me to review Empire Strikes Back. Just because I've got about a million things going on. But nevertheless, look forward to my review of Empire Strikes Back. Looking forward to reviewing that one. Coming very, very soon on this channel. But until then, guys, thank you as always for watching or listening to this podcast. And if you haven't yet, please do click down below and like and subscribe on this podcast. And look forward to many more podcasts coming very, very soon on this channel. As I've already said, thank you as always for watching or listening to this podcast. And I suppose that's it. Yeah, somehow we got to the end. I will see you guys again soon. But bye for now. Bye.